Hello and welcome to the 807th meeting of the Economic Club of New York. I'm Barbara Van Allen, President and CEO. I'm happy that everyone was able to join us today. And I'd like to welcome, of course, students joining us from several universities, actually, Harvard, Columbia, and Georgetown, as well as members of our 2025 class of ECNY Fellows. The Economic Club of New York is proud to stand as the nation's leading nonpartisan platform for discussions on economic, social, and political issues. We've been doing this for more than a century, and we're delighted to have such a platform of excellence that we, again, today bring you two of the leading economists in the country, actually, frankly, probably globally, ECNY club members Glenn Hubbard and Larry Summers. As I always say, they really need no introduction, but for our new members and guests, let me just quickly run through. Glenn is director of the Jerome Chasen Institute for Global Business, Dean Emeritus, and the Russell Carson Professor of Finance and Economics at Columbia Business School. He holds degrees from the University of Central Florida and a PhD in economics from Harvard. Glenn's published over 100 academic articles, several books. His insights appear regularly in major media outlets like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Financial Times. He served as chair of the U.S. Council of Economic Advisor under President George W. Bush. He certainly sits currently on the boards of Total Energies, BlackRock Fixed Income Funds, and MetLife, where he serves as chair. He's also co-chair of the Committee on Capital Markets Regulation and a former chair of our club. Larry is the Charles W. Eliot University Professor and President Emeritus of Harvard. He served in a series of senior policy positions in Washington, including the 71st Secretary of Treasury for President Clinton, Director of the National Economic Council for President Obama, and Vice President of Development Economics and Chief Economist for the World Bank. He currently chairs the board of the Center for Global Development, serves as vice chair of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and holds board director roles at DOMA, OpenAI, and Skillsoft Corporation. Larry has degrees from MIT and Harvard. Today's format will be a conversation between our two guests, ending promptly at 1 p.m. As a reminder, this conversation is on the record. We do have a fair amount of media on the line. Glenn and Larry, I'm turning it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara. Larry, good afternoon. There's certainly more than one or two things to talk about in the world. We've got distinctions between risk and uncertainty, familiar to all economists. We have the IEPA court decision. We have gloomy FOMC minutes. We have what I would have called TCJA 2.0, which I guess is now OBB, one big, beautiful bill. We have a possible war on research at our respective universities. And much to talk about. We're 7 weeks after Liberation Day. The S&P 500 10-year yield on a bit of a roller coaster. So I wanted to, if we can, just start with the outlook. I mean, we got our revised print on GDP. If we have on again, off again tariffs, the Fed's on hold for now. Let's start just by calibrating the near term. What are the odds, do you think, of a recession this year?
I've kind of been going back and forth on both sides of 50-50, depending on how aggressive I think the administration is going to be. When they seem especially determined, I'm especially pessimistic. When the taco trade in markets seems to be panning out, I become a bit more encouraged. I think we're towards a taco moment. And so I think the odds right now of a recession this year are way elevated from where they were on election or inauguration day, but are probably just below 50-50 right now. I think the risks are magnified by the fact that given the inflation pressures that are coming from the tariffs, I think the Fed is not going to be in a position to move very rapidly. I think the level of the budget deficit is also going to be an inhibition for the Fed to moving very rapidly. But I would say that there has been a sentiment to statistics gap for the last couple months in the economy, with the sentiment being darker and the statistics not getting all the way there in terms of the darkness. And I'd say, if anything, there's been a little bit of tendency of late for the sentiment to improve rather than what I probably would have guessed 2 months ago for the statistics to deteriorate. So I'm a bit under 50-50 on a recession, but not by very much. What about you?
Yeah, I would agree with that, Larry. I think of it in Don Rumsfeld terms. So I think of the known knowns and the known unknowns, and then particularly the unknown tail risk that I do worry about. For known knowns, the tariffs are obviously, uh, if they all stick, we'll see, post-court decision, have the incentive to slow growth and lead to stagflation. But those are not enough to cause a recession by themselves. They may be annoying, but they're not enough to cause a recession. The known unknown to me is the stock market. We saw the reaction after Liberation Day, but equity markets have rebounded, even though tariffs remain a lot higher than they were ex ante. So that I call it a known unknown. I'm watching that one. The unknown unknown, it seems to me, is the trust in the US-led international order, the bond market, the dollar. I don't want to be alarmist, but tail risks are tail risks, but they're not zero. And that's the thing that worries me more than whether we're going to have a recession in the next 12 months. And we did see the quote yippiness of the bond market after Liberation Day. Things have quieted down, but we still have term premia in bond yields that are concerning. And we'll come back to the Fed and the deficit, but at least in terms of the outlook, those known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns worry me.
I don't disagree with any of that. I pay a lot of attention to correlation structure in markets. There's a traditional American pattern. It's behind the risk parity trade. Stocks go up, bond yields go up at the same time. And so stocks and bonds have a bit of a negative correlation. And when that happens, the dollar goes up as well because capital inflows are coming. And that and its converse are a kind of traditional American pattern. We had a somewhat different pattern in the Carter period before Paul Volcker came into office. If you look at any Latin American country, they've got a quite different pattern. It's kind of a submerging, emerging market pattern where stocks, bonds, and the currency all move in the same direction on any given day. We have had a breakout in the United States of the submerging market, emerging market pattern. And that's a sign that we're being seen uh, differently and seen in terms of the kind of risks that you describe. So I agree with you on a period of elevated risk. I think that in some sense, the taco mentality is a little bit encouraging in suggesting that we may have some sweaty palms and there may be some real issues, but that if major problems start to emerge, then actions will be taken and we won't keep digging the hole that much deeper. The only other thing I'd add is I have come increasingly to wonder whether the economy has more underlying momentum and less underlying cyclicality than it used to. The fact that housing is a smaller share of the economy, the fact that inventories are a smaller share of the economy, the fact that services and bits are a larger share of the economy, the fact that the supply of credit comes from many more sources, and the fact that financially hurt institutions, financially hurt people are more able to borrow and keep spending after they absorb a blow than they used to be. All of that imparts a kind of underlying momentum to the economy. And it's worth remembering that it's been 35 years since 1991, 34 years. And we had a recession when we had a incredible bubble that burst with the NASDAQ. We had a recession when we had the wholesale massive over leveraging of of major financial intermediaries. And we had a recession when we had a pandemic. But in more than a generation, it's been three recessions, each with a large event behind it. And I think that's just worth
Yeah,
keeping in mind in forming judgments.
I agree. The one thing I would add to that is the role of uncertainty for business people that may make this cycle, if you will, a little different. Many business executives I speak to are delaying anything they can until they figure whether it's a capital project, employment project, M&A. That's not healthy either. So we'll see, I suppose, as the tariff situation clarifies. I want to go to the Fed though, and a couple of things maybe we could talk about. As we both said, the Fed's kind of on hold for the moment. I think reasonably so. But do you think that if you were to read the economy's trajectory and the inflation trajectory, the Fed is right to remain on hold for an extended period of time? I mean, how do you see that?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea when you don't know which way to turn, don't take a big step. And I don't think it's 100% clear whether the Fed should be thinking accelerator because of possible economic slowdown or should be thinking brakes because of possible inflation risk. So I think in the Fed shoes, I would want to be quite cautious about moving. And it seems to me that in a heated political environment, in a moment of incipient transition for the Fed's leadership, in a moment when there's all kinds of things happening with the budget, I think all of those things also counsel being at, I don't know whether to say stage left or stage right or stage off, but being restrained and not in the forefront also seems to me institutionally prudent for the Fed, and that militates here.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things to add to your points, of which I agree. I do think the Fed is going to have to think hard about its weights between the economy and inflation. The most recent FOMC minutes suggest the Fed is seeing softening coming in the future. At the same time, it's seeing price pressures still elevated. So they're supposed to look at both of those. And the question is what the weight is. Personally, I think the Fed should look through tariffs in the sense that a tariff is a one-time change. That said, if the tariff leads to a great deal of uncertainty or an unmooring of expectations about the future path of prices, I would worry. I don't know how you feel about the tariff complication to what the Fed's going to have to do.
I understand why you said what you said, and I certainly have spent a lot of classroom hours distinguishing between high prices and rising prices, between one-off price increasing events and events that produce continuing increases in prices. And so I think you got the analytic on that exactly right, but you also sort of got the qualification uh, right that this is a lot about psychology. The current Fed's experience with the term transitory has not been a happy one. And saying that tariffs are a transitory shock just seems infelicitous, sitting where they are. And I do think, therefore, substantial caution uh, is um, is in order. And I don't know that we would want to be certain, given the behavior of the administration, um, that tariffs were one-off. That in an outcome where we had tariffs and they were relatively well and benignly managed, I wouldn't be surprised if we then said, well, this worked pretty well, so let's have a further increase in tariffs. So the one-offness of the tariffs is not to be treated for granted. I don't, I think we need to just pause for a moment to emphasize that this, in many ways, is our first iatrogenic financial crisis, or our first iatrogenic economic difficulty is probably a fairer way to put it. Iatrogenic illness is when you go into the hospital and you get a staph infection from the very institution and location that is trying to cure you. And we are experiencing right now in the United States an iatrogenic supply shock. This isn't because of an OPEC embargo. This isn't because of some action of another country. This isn't because some market force decided to drive the uh, dollar down. This is entirely self-imposed through our own policy. And there's no reason why we need to be facing it.
Yeah, I want to come to that in a minute and how the administration might characterize it at least. But I want to finish up on the Fed. We're almost certainly going to have a new Fed chair. Without talking about the personnel angles, what else might need to change? Are there other organizational issues for the Federal Reserve or communications issues? If we're going to have a new Fed chair, and I'm almost sure we will, what should he or she be thinking about in terms of organization and communication?
I think the Fed, I've said this, I think on one of these calls before, Glenn. I think the Fed needs to beat a bit of a retreat back to the Delphi Oracle approach. The Delphi oracles understood that they were perceived as omnipotent and omniscient, but in fact they were neither. And they responded to that by keeping their pronouncements vague, infrequent, and oracular to the point of being unfalsifiable. That was a wisdom that Paul Volcker and Alan Greenspan deeply internalized. They tended to not make statements that were capable of being wrong. Um, we are committed to cooperating to pursue our mandate in the context of volatile and changing circumstances. That statement does not lend itself to being proven wrong, the way saying I expect inflation to be 2.3% over the next quarter does lend itself to being proven wrong. Alan Greenspan famously told a congressman, if you think you understood what I just said, you're wrong. And I think that the Fed should not feel a need to answer every question. Um, I think there's an important lesson in financial communication in what I regard as the two most successful bits of financial communication in the last 35 years. Um, the best bit of emergency financial communication in the last 35 years was Mario Draghi's famous utterance from the back, from literally the back of an envelope. Uh, we will do whatever it takes, and believe me, that is a lot. Um, that was not a description of what they were going to do. It didn't include a target for quantitative easing. It didn't include answers to any of the questions that ECB watchers had, but its clarity came from its simplicity. That's probably the greatest bit of financial crisis communication of the last 35 years. I would argue that the most successful bit of normal times financial communication approach in the last 35 years was my former boss and friend Bob Rubin's invocation of the idea that a strong dollar is in our national interest. Well, Mr. Rubin, do you feel that other currencies are too weak? No, I believe that a strong dollar is in our national interest. But is it possible, Mr. Rubin, that the dollar could become too strong? I believe that a strong dollar, based on strong fundamentals, is in our national interest. That approach, which on the one hand didn't share very much information, involved making no sophisticated statements that demonstrated economic or financial understanding, was, I think, itself highly sophisticated in imbuing confidence, where other approaches that involved explaining theories and reporting on research and commenting on recent developments were, I think, much less efficacious. And so I think the accoutrement of transparency have been very substantially overdone in the Federal Reserve system. One of the challenges of transparency, whether it is with one's children, whether it is with one's colleagues, or in the context of an institution like the Fed, is that transparency is a one-way ratchet. Now, the Supreme Court knows one thing with absolute certainty. If there ever comes a day when Supreme Court meetings are televised, that is not a policy that will ever be walked backwards. And so moving to more transparency has a kind of inevitable permanence to it. And I think the Fed has gone too far. I had a couple of students who, at my suggestion, did a quite careful analysis in which they looked at Fed days, 8 Wednesdays a year, and they looked at market moves at 3 moments on Wednesday. At 2 o'clock, when the FOMC statement came out, at 2:30, when the chair read the chair's statement of what was going to happen, and during the hour-long subsequent press conference. In recent years, the greatest drama has become the ongoing process of answering at the press conference. And I don't know what good is done by that. I would argue that the Fed should figure out what it has to say it clearly so that the market moves in the collective statement. If somehow the market has misinterpreted the collective statement, then it should correct that in the context of the chair's opening statement. But that the press conference should be managed to be a non-event with revelation of information to the extent that it's desired taking place in a pre-planned way, and to the extent it's undesired, not happening. So I use that as an illustration of a more general principle that cacophonies are rarely informative.
Yeah, I would.
That goes to what the
Yeah.
Chair does, it goes to the wisdom or lack of wisdom of the dot plot. It goes to the extent of subordinate figures at the Fed speech making. Um, I don't think more information is always more clarity of communication.
Yeah, I would agree with all that, Larry. I would start by saying I would like to see the Fed narrow its mission more to monetary policy and getting rid of extraneous topics. I actually think the Fed plays too big of a role in financial regulation, which is a very political subject as opposed to monetary policy. I do think there's way too much communication. I agree with you that the Greenspan Volcker era brings a lot to be desired. It's hard to go back and will be
That was
hard
my
for
ratchet point.
a new Fed chair, but hopefully he or she would do that. And I definitely agree. We have too many speeches from regional bank presidents, from Fed governors, as opposed to a point of view. So hopefully, as the new Fed chair is named, this is an opportunity to rethink some of those issues as well as personnel.
So Glenn, we're in raging agreement on the communication issue. Um, I think I agree with you, and I actually think there have been constructive steps taken. Um, I found it appalling when a year or two ago the Minneapolis Fed was involved in taking a position on school reform in the state of Minnesota. I frankly think the world can do without the opinions of central bankers on climate change. And I think the disingenuous attempt to insinuate climate change as an important risk on bank loans as a way of establishing relevance for central bank governors was quite unfortunate. And I am glad, and I think it's good for the world that Mark Carney now has a job where it is extremely appropriate for him to provide the kind of wise moral leadership of which he is capable on climate issues. I don't think he had such a job when he was at the Bank of England. I'm interested in, I don't know that I disagree, but I was a little surprised by your comment on financial regulation. Um, on the one hand, I think you're probably right that financial regulation is more political than monetary policy, but I'm not sure it should be as political as it sometimes is. And one way of making it less political has been to put it at the Fed. And I would say my own judgment, as I have watched, is that the sophistication and wisdom that the Fed has brought to bear on questions of financial regulation has frankly exceeded that of the other agencies. And so I would be a bit cautious about turfing financial regulation out of the Fed uh, to other agencies. Part of that is just excellence and expertise. Part of that, and I would have guessed you would agree on this, is that the Fed sort of brings an economist approach to regulation, whereas some of the other players bring more of a lawyer's
Lawyers, yeah.
approach.
No,
And
I
I
agree with
think the
all of it.
analytic approach of economics is actually a valuable one.
Yeah, no, I agree with the cautions and trade-offs. My point was simply that it's hard to say monetary policy is completely independent if the organization is also assuming large roles in regulation too, which the Congress has every interest and willingness and right to question. I want to turn to trade because it's a big issue. We just had the IEPA decision. I don't know about you, but I start by asking myself, what is the exact imbalances problem that the administration is trying to solve? So one representation is it's a series of bilateral trade imbalances. As an economist, that doesn't seem like it's a terribly interesting question. Another might be that it's about the whole current account, But again, as an economist, I think, well, that's just the mirror of the capital account. And if you cared about that, then you'd be interested in changing national saving, presumably not reducing national investment. If I were interested in revitalizing manufacturing, I'm not sure current trade policy would be where I would go, given that about half of our imports are intermediate goods, and I'm not sure how it helps manufacturing to tariff those intermediate goods. So how do you see, what's the question you think we're trying to uh, ask and answer? Because if it seems to be more about revitalizing manufacturing, which seems to come up a lot in the communications, I can think of a number of tax policies, regulatory policies, permitting policies, even research policies that might push that better than tariffs. But I don't know, how do you see the question and answer?
I find the current trajectory of policy and the current policy approach almost wholly inappropriate, unwise, and based on fallacy. And you identified the first three fallacies that I articulate. Uh, why worry about bilateral deficits in a triangular trade world? Wouldn't you rather live in a country that capital is trying to get into than a country that capital is trying to get out of? And why wouldn't you think that there were going to be better, healthier jobs in things you export than in things you import? And restricting imports inevitably restricts exports, including because imports are inputs uh, into exports. So I agree with all with all of that, and I think that there are legitimate arguments um, for which I mostly am not that enthusiastic about. But there are, whereas the three things we just discussed, I kind of think there's right and wrong, fallacy and not fallacy. I think you can make a case for um, anti-dumping and anti-subsidy broadly understood, which will involve certain kinds of retaliation. And you can make a case that the situation brought about by China necessitates more of that than we have traditionally engaged in. You can make a case that resilience requires a greater focus on avoiding potential bottlenecks and are being subject to leverage uh, through embargo. You can make those cases. You may be able to make a case that where we have lagged behind and it's desperately important that we catch up, you need to have a period of grace for, I would call it, perhaps there's a corollary to infant industry theory around rehabbing injured industry protection. I would be on the skeptical of all three of those arguments, just like you and I disagree a little bit about corporate tax incentives. But I respect, as a reasonable opinion and a reasonable judgment of the evidence, more enthusiasm for some of them than I have. I would feel the same way about certain kinds of restrictionist policies. But the policies that we have pursued seem to me to be unjustifiable on any economic theory that I can understand. And I like to use the example of a football team. A football team thinking about a new offensive play first runs it in practice against no defense, and then they run it, and then they have to run it with a defense. If they can't run the play when there is no defense and the play is counterproductive, then it's probably a pretty terrible play. And I think our tariff policies do us a bunch of damage before anybody retaliates against those policies, as inevitably they will in some way. And I think another thing that's just a kind of important aspect of that, I think one of the most important things that any senior policymaker possesses, and that most importantly, a president of the United States possesses or does not possess, is credibility. And steadiness is an important part of credibility. And you can overdo that. We probably stayed in Vietnam too long, with the excuse being that we'd said we would, so we had to. So you could overdo investing in credibility. But it seems to me that the extraordinary volatility of our tariff policies has served, both in the trade area and other areas, to cause the word of the President of the United States to be taken less seriously as a prediction of what U.S. actions were going to be. And I think that's a pretty costly and problematic thing.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that it's incumbent upon the rest of us, I guess, to think of what better off ramps would be, which is why I start with what the heck is the question? And if it really is about manufacturing, which is a reasonable question, and resilience, to articulate better things to do. One of those off ramps, though, does involve tax policy. So I want to segue, if I can, to the TCJA 2.0, or the One Big Beautiful Bill, whatever you want to call it. I don't know about you, I have a number of concerns with it. First, the very large deficit, at least on a current law baseline that it implies. I don't particularly buy that the tariff revenue is going to be large enough to offset that, for all the reasons we've been tacoing about this afternoon. I'm a little concerned that we're missing some opportunities on the business side. I think we could have had like the original Republican study blueprint in 2017, we could have had a destination-based cash flow tax. We could have border adjustments, which would be kind of America first. They stop multinationals' incentives to leave America, but they're not tariffs, despite what the Trump administration sometimes says. So we missed some opportunities, and they would raise revenue that you could have used to have a smaller deficit. So I give points. I think corporate expensing is a good idea. In my view, I'm happy to see that, happy to see better R&D. But I think we could have had something that said, let's at least get the current law baseline neutrality within 5 years, use border adjustments for revenue. I think we could have had a lot that could have made this bill better. I don't know what you think about OBBB.
I agree with the majority of that. I would substitute the alliteration "deadly dangerous decline" for the alliteration "big beautiful bill." I think we are tempting fate in terms of debt accumulation with these measures. Uh, Reconciliation comes along less frequently than Christmas. And so I think when you have a reconciliation moment and you squander the opportunity to address the principal fiscal challenge, you're making a very serious mistake. I am interested in your idea, which has also occurred to me, of turning the word border adjustment in a corporate tax into a quasi synonym for tariff, and using it as a way for policy to evolve. My guess is that in the political environment, that's too complicated by more than half. And so it's unlikely to happen. But I think it's an interesting idea to explore. I'm probably a little bit less worried than you are about the need for expensing. I tended to be very much with your and my revered mentor, Marty Feldstein, in supporting various kinds of business capital investment breaks for a long time. As investment has become shorter lived, as leverage and the ability to borrow and deduct has increased, and as in response to international arbitrage pressure, corporate tax rates have come substantially down. And as the share of corporate income that's taxed at the individual level has gone steadily down, as more and more of it is in endowments and pensions and the like, I feel the urge for new tax incentives much less strongly than I would have 20 or 25 years ago. So at the margin, I would probably rather see resources go to deficit reductions than corporate tax breaks, given how far the share of corporate profits taxes relative to corporate profits as measured in the national income accounts or on corporate income statements, those ratios have come way, way down. And I wouldn't make it a priority to bring them down further from here. I would want to see us rejuvenate, and I think the Trump administration has been going badly in the other direction, the efforts to cooperate with respect to avoiding tax haven jurisdictions and with respect to egregious corporate sheltering. I wonder whether you'd agree with this. I always thought that the United States should kind of pursue a narrow field, high fences or high attack approach with respect to the tax haven issue. I always thought that if somebody wants to be a libertarian paradise and not have any corporate taxes, and a lot of businesses want to locate there, more power to them, let them try it. If, however, the juice is coming from being a low tax jurisdiction and having a lot of income located there without economic substance, that's a much more problematic thing. And so our approach ought to be to prevent the diversion and non-taxation of income without substance, but to recognize that countries will compete on the quality of their business environment.
Well, on that point, as you noted, the administration is going a bit in the other direction. In the new bill, there is a proposal that's effectively a tariff on inbound investment from countries that do things we don't like a digital services tax or global minimum tax that you're referring to. That's in the other direction. I keep coming back. If you had a fundamental reform like the destination-based tax, you wouldn't have many of these issues. You wouldn't have the tax planning issues about the location of income from American multinationals. So I would just go back to the source.
Glenn, I am not knowledgeable enough about the destination-based tax to strongly endorse it as a complete overhaul of the global corporate tax system. I just haven't given it enough thought to do that. I am sympathetic to the arguments and the impulse. If I thought it had a 3% chance of happening, I would be invested in studying it and developing my views with more nuance. And I just haven't taken that step. And if you tell me that it does have more than a 3% chance, I will believe you and go off and do the relevant study.
Yeah, I think you should study. I think the slight advantage it has this time over 2017 is in 2017, the merchants were organized against it for not crazy commercial reasons. But now the status quo is not zero. The status quo is high and variable tariffs. So I think the merchants may feel differently, but that's just one man's
I think
view.
I hear you on that, but I think in the economics profession, we can do this and we can do the destination-based thing instead of tariffs is a really appealing idea. I don't think that the administration would be likely to see them as alternatives
Yeah. Well,
rather
we'll
than
see.
as complements, and I think that could be extremely
Yeah.
problematic.
Well, we'll see what the courts help us or not with. I wanted to get to two more areas if I could. One is the deficits, and the other is our favorite topic, our day job in universities. So on deficits and debt, as you noted, we're in a particular problem. It's not just the one big beautiful bill. We're going to need to spend more on defense. The administration's asking for that. We have interest rates that appear to be elevated to a level that at least the CBO found somewhat surprising. How do we think about where we are in deficits and debt? My fear is that if we don't bring the deficit down to, say, at least maybe 3% of GDP as opposed to 6 or 7% of GDP, and we have interest rates that remain elevated, and we need to spend more on defense, we are going to ignite a bond crisis. But wanted your view.
So first of all, I am much more worried about dependence on China as a debt holder than I am dependence on China as a supplier of lithium or beryllium or anything else. And I think there's a fundamental national security question of how long the world's greatest debtor can remain the world's greatest power. I share your view that the deficit is worse than people think. My guess is that thinking when you make the appropriate adjustments, like the one you did for defense and the one you referred to for higher interest rates, I think if people think of the out year deficit as on a trajectory towards 8%, that would be a good way for them to think about it if nothing is done. I share your sense that we very much ought to be uh, doing something. I think that to be intellectually honest, um, one needs to acknowledge the possibility. I wouldn't go so far as to say the probability, but I think it is a real possibility that AI will bail us out of this. That if AI provides the kind of productivity improvement that IT and the internet provided during the 1990s, this problem could melt away. And I think it's about the same magnitude. If you had 1% a year more growth sustained for a decade, all the deficit and debt numbers would look profoundly different. And I think that might happen. You know, I also think that I might shoot par the next time I play golf, but it wouldn't be something somebody would want to bet on. And somebody certainly wouldn't want to insure me against being over par. And so I don't think that is something that can be relied on. But I do think we do need to recognize that if you ask, how did we achieve the great progress we did in the 1990s, where when I left office as Treasury Secretary, we had a budget surplus, some of it was the measures we did, but more of it was the acceleration of growth that happened. And that is at least a possibility in the years ahead that I think we need to recognize.
I agree, but I think we probably can't forget about spending restraint as well, or tax increases, depending on your political view. Doug Elmendorf and Zach Liskow and I just did a study, came out in BER paper this week. We looked at all the policies that we think of as pro-growth that are on the agenda. And two things are true about them. One, we don't really know enough about the quantitative magnitudes. And second, even if we did them, maybe we'd get halfway to what you're trying. So it could be that AI bails us out, and I hope you're right, but I'm less
I
sure that
read
we
your
need to do something.
I read your paper. I thought your paper was very interesting. I admired you for writing it, but I think it did miss something that was very important, which is what we've just been touching on. Your paper was about could the government do any policies that would
Yes,
transform the growth outlook? And I agree with your tone of a bit of skepticism in the paper. It's a different question
correct,
to
correct.
say, could something happen from the American private sector that means that we're in a moment that has some of the character of 1995?
Yeah,
And I think that is a much stronger argument that one has to think about as
I
one
agree. The flip,
addresses all of this, not to the point where I think we can rely on that being
yeah.
true.
I mean, the flip side of that coin, of course, if AI as a general purpose technology were that fast and that potent, query what are the employment aspects of that and the political economy considerations around that. So it's not just raining down from the sky an extra percentage point of growth.
No,
So
my, you're making a very good point. My friend Daron Acemoglu
he's more
takes
pessimistic than I am, but
takes
that's
the no, he
yeah,
takes the
yeah,
quite extraordinary position that AI will have almost no positive productivity effect, but have devastating disemployment effects.
yeah,
I think that's a contradiction.
yeah. I
I
think
think if
it's
it
both are
does
needed.
one, it's likely to do the
Right,
other.
right.
And I think you're right to caution us that if we have more rapid productivity growth, we may have more social insurance needs.
Yeah. So I want to turn, if I can, to universities. We sit in universities that are of particular interest, apparently, to the Trump administration, but universities generally, and there are a plethora of issues, ranging from international students, ranging to the funding of R&D by the federal government, student loans, anti-Semitism issues in universities. At least from the way I see it, certainly on the ground issues like anti-Semitism, I view that as a black and white matter. Anti-Semitism is wrong, full stop. It's a moral question. It's also a legal question in Title VI. But at a bigger picture level, I'm concerned that universities may have lost their way a bit. To me, and I realize this is controversial, the purpose of a university I think of as research and teaching, not social justice. Social justice may be a byproduct of those, and what you decide the purpose of the university is kind of frames some of these issues and what the state may feel about it. So I don't know what your thoughts are.
Here's some things that I think are true. Uh, our universities are an incredible national asset. It, with the possible exception of IT, it's hard to think of another industry where the United States has so definitive a global lead. Immigrants to our universities won us World War II with the Manhattan Project. Uh, our universities are the source of our prosperity in technology. They're the source of the strategic doctrine that won us the Cold War. Their influence on foreigners contributed to everything from the emancipation of women around the world to the fall of the Berlin Wall. They are a priceless national asset. Proposition one. Proposition two, there's a lot that needs to be adjusted. It's not entirely uncorrelated with the comments you and I were making about the Fed in terms of a need to get back to core uh, business. I I think part of academic freedom is understanding in universities that if we want the government to leave us alone, we have to leave the government alone a bit. And that means some of the crusading for social justice that takes place in universities is problematic. I think it's a disturbing commentary on Harvard University, and the same thing would be true at almost any elite university. That whereas I, Larry Summers, think of myself as being on the 40-yard line of the nation on some left right continuum, I'd call myself on the 40-yard line of the left. At Harvard, I think of myself as being on the 15-yard line of the right. And there's got to be something that is off about that. And I think in important ways, particularly around the primacy of identity politics, universities have lost their way. That said, I think that we are a country where if you murder somebody on videotape, there's a hearing before there's any punishment extracted. The complete failure of process before there were cutoffs of funds, the complete non-correlation between the cancer researchers doing their work and the hot-headed yahoos shouting anti-Semitic slogans without being disciplined enough, the what's being done and what the response is bears no resemblance to what the things that have happened that are wrong, and the epistemological reality that in a free society the government can't run the universities, even if it aspires to, means that the response of the administration, it seems to me, is completely disproportionate, inappropriate, and ironically going to be counterproductive because the people who want to keep the Ivy League a bastion of social justice are walking around feeling stronger right now than they have any time in years because they are able to wrap themselves in opposition to the dubious Trump administration rather than in the dubious arguments that are available to them to support their social justice position. So this has been completely counterproductive in terms of its objective. My hope is that the judiciary is going to respond in ways that are going to craft more effective remedies than we've yet seen. Yes, there is a tyrannical aspect that needs to be resisted, but there are also institutions that are in bad need of reform. And so I am really angry with the people who are just trying to deny, the daughter of the Prime Minister of Canada the opportunity to study at an American university. That's just crazy from the point of view of our country's interest. But the many of our colleagues, Glenn, who think that now that we're under attack by the Trump administration, we can't say or recognize anything critical about ourselves. That's also very
Yeah, I think
dangerous and counterproductive. And so, as in so many things, we need to find a balance.
Yeah, I hope that universities, including our two, will use this as a soul-searching moment because there is a real need for reform and for purpose. But I see Barbara on, so that means we're getting the cane, I'm afraid.
Wow, this was, I think, one of the best conversations that you guys have shared with us, and I want to thank you both. We could have definitely gone on for another hour, and maybe even longer. But thank you again, both of you. I want to just share very quickly a couple upcoming events. We have Dr. Adriana Kugler, a member of the Board of Governors of the Fed, on June the 5th for a luncheon. On June 10th, we'll hear more about tariffs from the U.S. Trade Rep, Jameson Greer, at a luncheon. And June the 26th, I'm sorry, let me jump in. On June the 12th, we just added Philippe Lafont will be interviewed by Glenn Hutchins, and on the 12th. And then we're lucky enough on June 26th to have Christina Hillsberger, former CIA agent, who has written a very intriguing book about her career in intelligence. And so please mark your calendars and join us for these exceptional programs. And As always, we want to thank those attending that represent members of the Centennial Society and thank them as their generous contributions provide vital support to the club and our mission. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and please have a wonderful afternoon. And thank you, Larry and Glenn. Great conversation. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.